It's 10:04 a.m. on September 27, 1945, and the most powerful man in Japan is sitting in a 1936 Daimler limousine 3 blocks from the American embassy in Tokyo. He's wearing a morning coat, striped trousers, and a top hat, the formal diplomatic uniform of another era. His hands are shaking. Emperor Hirohito has never done anything like this before. Japanese emperors don't make social calls. They don't visit subordinates. For 2,600 years, at least according to the official mythology, emperors have been living gods, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. It's 10:04 a.m. on September 27, 1945, and the most powerful man in Japan is sitting in a 1936 Daimler limousine 3 blocks from the American embassy in Tokyo. He's wearing a morning coat, striped trousers, and a top hat, the formal diplomatic uniform of another era. His hands are shaking. Emperor Hirohito has never done anything like this before. Japanese emperors don't make social calls. They don't visit subordinates. For 2,600 years, at least according to the official mythology, emperors have been living gods, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. People don't look directly at them. They certainly don't summon them to meetings. But General Douglas MacArthur did exactly that. And now Hirohito, who 6 weeks ago was the divine sovereign of an empire stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, is about to walk into a foreign military headquarters and face the man who conquered his nation. The interpreter sitting next to him in the limousine would later say the emperor asked him the same question 3 times during that short drive. Do you think he will have me arrested? Nobody knew, not even MacArthur's own staff. What happened in the next 37 minutes would determine whether Japan became a Soviet satellite, descended into civil war, or rebuilt itself into something the world had never seen before. And the crazy thing? We still don't know exactly what was said in that room. No official notes were kept. No recording was made. We have 2 contradictory accounts, one from MacArthur, one from the Japanese interpreter, and 80 years of historians arguing about which one is true. But we have the photograph. And that photograph changed everything. To understand why this meeting mattered, why these 37 minutes were more important than some battles, you need to understand what Japan looked like in September 1945. The country was destroyed. Not damaged, not beaten, destroyed. 66 cities had been firebombed into ash. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been erased by atomic weapons. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which 4 years earlier had been the 3rd most powerful naval force on Earth, was at the bottom of the Pacific. 2 million Japanese soldiers were dead. The home islands were occupied by foreign troops for the first time in recorded history, and sitting at the top of this wreckage was Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. SCAP, they called it, with absolute authority over Japan's reconstruction. He answered to Washington, but Washington was 6,000 miles away. In practical terms, MacArthur had more power over Japan than any shogun ever had. He could have arrested the emperor. He could have put him on trial as a war criminal. Many people, including the Soviet Union, Australia, and a sizable chunk of the American public, wanted exactly that. The emperor, meanwhile, was in an impossible position. He'd just done something unprecedented. He'd recorded a radio address announcing Japan's surrender. Most Japanese people had never heard his voice before. The speech was delivered in formal court Japanese, so archaic that millions of listeners didn't fully understand it. But the message got through. The war was over. Japan had lost. The unthinkable had happened. Here on obscure WWII Chronicles, this is exactly the kind of moment we dig into. The hinge points that don't involve beaches or tanks, but changed history just as much. If you're here for the stories that textbooks skip, hit subscribe. You're in the right place. So now you've got these 2 men, MacArthur and Hirohito, about to meet face to face. One is 65 years old, 6 feet tall, a career soldier who's never lost a campaign and has an ego the size of the Pacific. The other is 44, 5'5", a marine biologist by training and an emperor by birth, who has lived his entire life inside a system of court ritual, so elaborate that it prescribed how many steps he should take per minute. They had nothing in common except this: the future of 72 million people depended on what happened when they shook hands. Let's start with MacArthur, because understanding him is essential to understanding why this meeting went the way it did. By September 1945, Douglas MacArthur was probably the most famous American alive. He'd commanded the Southwest Pacific Theater, accepted the Japanese surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, and now ruled Japan with a level of authority that made him, in practical terms, an American emperor. He'd been a general since 1918. He'd been Army Chief of Staff. He'd won the Medal of Honor in the Philippines. His career was a catalogue of brilliance, ego, insubordination, and results. MacArthur had opinions about everything, and he expressed them with absolute certainty. He wore custom-made uniforms. He carried a swagger stick. He staged photographs. He referred to himself in the third person. Eisenhower, who had served as his aide in the 1930s, once said working for MacArthur taught him the art of dramatics. That's a polite way of saying the man had a flair for theater. But here's the thing about MacArthur that gets lost in the personality. He was a genuinely brilliant administrator. Flamboyant? Yes. Arrogant? Absolutely. But the man understood occupation policy in a way that most generals didn't. He'd governed the Philippines before the war. He knew you couldn't rule a conquered nation through fear alone. You needed legitimacy. You needed systems. You needed the population to believe that cooperation was better than resistance. And MacArthur had decided, over the objections of many in Washington, that he needed Hirohito. This was not a popular decision. Australia wanted Hirohito hanged. The Soviet Union wanted him in the dock at Tokyo alongside Tojo and the other war criminals. Public opinion polls in the United States showed that a plurality of Americans wanted him punished, and the evidence against him was substantial. Every atrocity, every war crime, every death from Singapore to Manila had been carried out in his name by his military under his seal. But MacArthur looked at the situation and made a cold calculation. If he arrested Hirohito, he'd need 1 million troops to occupy Japan. The country would fracture. Resistance movements would form. The Soviets would exploit the chaos. The reconstruction would fail. If he kept Hirohito, if he used the emperor's authority to legitimize the occupation, he could control Japan with a fraction of the troops and rebuild the country into a stable, democratic ally. It was ruthlessly pragmatic. And it was also a massive gamble, because it required Hirohito to cooperate. The emperor could have refused to meet. He could have abdicated. He could have become a figurehead for resistance. MacArthur needed him to publicly, willingly, accept the occupation, hence the summons. Now let's talk about Hirohito. Because the man who stepped off that Daimler on September 27th was not the god emperor of Japanese propaganda. Hirohito was a quiet, scholarly man who had spent most of his life studying marine biology. He'd published papers on hydrozoa. He'd built a laboratory in the imperial palace. By all accounts, he would have been perfectly happy spending his life classifying jellyfish and avoiding public attention. But he'd been born into a role he couldn't escape. He became crown prince in 1912 and emperor in 1926 during the Showa era, which translates with heavy irony as enlightened peace. His reign had been anything but peaceful. The military had dominated Japanese politics throughout the 1930s. The invasion of Manchuria, the war in China, the attack on Pearl Harbor, all of it had happened under his seal, with his approval or at least his acquiescence. How much personal responsibility Hirohito bore for Japan's wars is one of the great historical debates of the 20th century. Some historians argue he was a figurehead, powerless against the militarists. Others argue He was an active participant who approved strategic decisions and could have stopped the madness but didn't. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the complicated middle. What we know for certain is this. By August 1945, Hirohito had done something extraordinary. When his military leaders deadlocked over whether to surrender after the atomic bombings, he broke the tie. He decided to end the war. In the rigid structure of Japanese imperial politics, that decision, what they called the sacred judgment, was unprecedented. The emperor had stepped out of his ceremonial role and made a choice that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And now, 3 weeks after the formal surrender, he'd made another choice. He was going to meet MacArthur, and he was going to take responsibility. The limousine arrived at the U.S. Embassy at exactly 10:05 a.m. The building itself was relatively undamaged, one of the few structures in Tokyo that hadn't been turned into rubble. MacArthur's staff had prepared for the visit with meticulous care. An honor guard was assembled. Protocol officers stood ready. Photographers were positioned, and then MacArthur, in a move that was either brilliant psychology or pure theater, probably both, didn't come downstairs to greet Hirohito. Think about that for a second. The Emperor of Japan, who had never in his life visited a subordinate, had just traveled across Tokyo to meet the American commander, and MacArthur made him come upstairs. The Emperor climbed the steps, walked through the embassy, and was shown into MacArthur's office on the second floor. MacArthur was waiting, standing casually near the fireplace. He wasn't wearing a tie. He wasn't wearing his medals. He was in standard khakis, the uniform he wore every day. His hands were in his pockets. The photograph was taken in the first 60 seconds of the meeting. Army photographer Lieutenant Gaetano Fayas clicked the shutter 3 times. The image shows everything you need to know about the power dynamic in that room. MacArthur, 6 feet tall, relaxed, hands at his sides, looking comfortable. Hirohito, nearly a foot shorter, ramrod straight, hands clenched, looking like a man who expected to be arrested at any moment. When that photograph was published in Japanese newspapers the next day, it caused a sensation. People were shocked, not by MacArthur's casual posture, but by the fact that they could see Hirohito at all, standing next to a foreign soldier like an ordinary man. The imperial household tried to suppress the image. They failed. Copies circulated everywhere. In one photograph, the myth of the divine emperor began to crack. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The photograph was just the beginning. After Fayas was dismissed, MacArthur did something unexpected. He sent everyone else out too. The meeting would be private, just MacArthur, Hirohito, and interpreter Reijiro Matsui. No aides, no note-takers, no witnesses. What happened in the next 37 minutes is one of those historical frustrations where we have the outline but not the details. We know how long they talked. We know the general topics. We have MacArthur's account, written years later in his memoirs. We have Matsui's account, recorded shortly after the meeting, and the two versions don't quite match. Here's what MacArthur claimed Hirohito said in his 1964 memoir, Reminiscences. If Hirohito actually said those words, and that's a big if, it would have been an act of extraordinary personal courage. The Emperor of Japan, stepping forward to take the blame for everything, offering himself up for trial or execution to protect his people. MacArthur wrote that he was so moved by this gesture that he decided on the spot to protect Hirohito from prosecution. "I was literally thunderstruck," he wrote. This courageous assumption of responsibility implied the emperor's indictment of his own ministers and advisors. It's a hell of a story, dramatic, emotional, the kind of scene Hollywood would kill for. There's just one problem. Matsui, the interpreter who was actually in the room, gave a very different account. According to Matsui's notes, Hirohito was much more tentative. He expressed regret for the war. He acknowledged his responsibility in a general sense, but he didn't offer himself for judgment. The conversation was polite, formal, and emotionally restrained, which frankly sounds a lot more like how a Japanese emperor trained in court protocol would actually speak. So which version is true? Honestly, I've read everything available on this meeting, and I'm not sure. MacArthur had a documented habit of embellishing stories to make himself look good. But it's also possible that Hirohito said something close to what MacArthur claimed, and the nuance got lost in translation or memory. Or maybe MacArthur just heard what he wanted to hear. A gesture of submission that justified the decision he'd already made. What we know for certain is this: both men left that room with what they needed. MacArthur needed Hirohito's cooperation, and he got it. From that day forward, the emperor publicly supported the occupation. He toured the country, visiting bombed cities and factories, showing himself to the people in a way no emperor had ever done. He became, in effect, MacArthur's instrument for controlling Japan. Hirohito needed protection from prosecution, and he got it. MacArthur refused every request to put him on trial. When the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in Tokyo in 1946 to try Japanese war criminals, Hirohito was not among the defendants. 28 men were indicted. 7 were hanged, including former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. The emperor remained untouchable. The deal was never stated explicitly. It didn't need to be. Both men understood the transaction. But there was one more element to that meeting that often gets overlooked. They talked about the future. According to both accounts, and here the versions agree, they discussed Japan's reconstruction. MacArthur outlined his vision: land reform, breaking up the zaibatsu monopolies, women's suffrage, a new constitution that renounced war forever. Radical changes, revolutionary changes. The kind of social engineering that would have been impossible without imperial backing. Hirohito listened. He asked questions. And when MacArthur was done, he agreed to support it all. The meeting ended at 10:42 a.m., 37 minutes. When Hirohito returned to his limousine, his hands had stopped shaking. The effects of that meeting rippled outward for decades. Within 6 months, MacArthur's staff, working with Japanese bureaucrats, under the emperor's implicit approval, had drafted a new constitution. Article 9 renounced war as a sovereign right. Article 1 reduced the emperor from a living god to the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people. Hirohito signed it. He had no choice, but also, and this is the complicated part, he seems to have genuinely believed it was necessary. Land reform followed. The old aristocratic estates were broken up and redistributed to farmers. Women got the vote in 1945. The first election was held in April 1946, and 39 women were elected to the Diet. The zaibatsu were dismantled, though they eventually reformed as the keiretsu, but that's a different story. Japan, under MacArthur's occupation and Hirohito's passive cooperation, transformed faster than any society in modern history. By 1952, when the occupation officially ended, Japan was a constitutional monarchy with a functioning democracy, a pacifist constitution, and an economy starting its climb toward becoming the second largest in the world. None of that was inevitable. It required 1,000 decisions, millions of people choosing cooperation over resistance. But it started in that room on September 27, 1945, when 2 men who had been enemies 6 weeks earlier made a deal. The costs of that deal are worth acknowledging. Hirohito never faced justice for his role in the war. The comfort women were ignored. The victims of the rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, they never got to see the man in whose name those atrocities were committed stand trial. MacArthur's decision to protect Hirohito was pragmatic, but it wasn't moral. Some wounds don't close just because they're politically inconvenient. And yet, Japan didn't become a Soviet satellite. It didn't collapse into civil war. It didn't require 1 million occupation troops or a decade of insurgency. Within a generation, it became one of America's closest allies and a stable, prosperous democracy. That outcome wasn't guaranteed. It was built, piece by piece, on the foundation of decisions made in rooms like that embassy office. MacArthur and Hirohito met multiple times after that first meeting. The formality gradually relaxed. By some accounts, they developed a genuine mutual respect, though friendship would be too strong a word. MacArthur left Japan in 1951, recalled by Truman during the Korean War. Hirohito remained emperor until his death in 1989, making him the longest reigning monarch in Japanese history. Neither man ever fully explained what was said in that 37-minute meeting. MacArthur's version became the official American narrative. The Japanese version remained more guarded, more ambiguous. The truth, whatever it was, stayed between them. I've stood outside the building where that meeting took place. It's not a museum. It's not marked with a plaque. It's just a building in Tokyo, occupied by offices, surrounded by the noise and traffic of a modern city. You could walk past it every day and never know that the future was decided there. But here's what strikes me about that meeting. It worked because both men were willing to bend. MacArthur could have demanded unconditional submission, public humiliation, a trial. Hirohito could have abdicated, refused cooperation, become a symbol of resistance. Either choice would have been emotionally satisfying. Neither choice would have rebuilt Japan. Instead, they made the harder choice. They set aside their egos, and if you know anything about MacArthur, you know how much that must have cost him, and did what the moment required. That photograph of the two of them, the one that shocked Japan in 1945, hangs in the National Archives now. File number 1111, SC210166. MacArthur towers over Hirohito, casual and confident. Hirohito stands rigid, formal, a man caught between two worlds. It's an image of conquest, yes, but it's also, if you look closely, an image of two people trying to figure out how to end a war. Without planting the seeds of the next one, they didn't get everything right. The decision to shield Hirohito from prosecution still generates debate and anger, especially among the victims of Japanese war crimes. That's legitimate. Some decisions don't have clean answers, but they got enough right that Japan rebuilt itself into a nation that has not fought a war in 80 years, that has to count for something. If this story made you think, if it complicated your understanding of what occupation and reconstruction actually look like, share it with someone who'd appreciate that complexity. And if your family has any connection to the occupation of Japan, American, or Japanese, we want to hear about it in the comments. Those stories matter. This is Obscure WWII Chronicles. Until next time.